So today we're going to pick up right at the beginning with the first step. But before I get on to that, I wanted to, well, this may seem odd for a Buddhist thing. Let's start with the Serenity Prayer. God?
God, grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
I wanted to start with a little bit that I stumbled across the other night in regards to the ethics and moral aspects of, in my view, both Buddhist teachings and the 12 steps. And this is something from Joseph Goldstein. It quickly became clear, though, that it is impossible to separate moral and ethical behavior from meditative realization. The entire spiritual journey rests on the morality of non-harming. This is the expression of the love and care we feel both for others and for ourselves. Without this foundation, wisdom does not endure. Especially in times of changing values like our own, the importance of personal integrity and responsibility needs to be re-articulated again and again so we do not get lost in the confusion of our own desires. Our challenge is to give this inquiry into essential moral values a deeper meaning, to give it a vitality in a modern world, and to do so without becoming moralistic, judgmental, or divisive. From the Buddhist perspective, all the moral precepts are rules of training, not commandments. We undertake them as a way of training our heart out of care for the world and ourselves, rather than as an externally imposed set of rules. This is a critical distinction because it enables us to look into our lives and our actions without guilt and crippling self-judgment, and at the same time to consciously take responsibility for what we do. And I just think that that really sort of sums up really nicely with both sides of what we're trying to do, which is to grow and evolve in a positive direction, but to do it really from our own volition rather than fear of some negative outcome, which is a lot different than the way I personally was raised. So I just wanted to get started with that. And how I wanted to really get into the morning was to talk about the first step. Probably part of it will end up being a bit of a drunkalogue, but it moves right into the Buddhist teachings for me. And those of you that have been here before have heard parts of this. Hopefully it won't be too boring. But like a lot of us, I grew up in a dysfunctional home. There was a lot of drinking, fair amount of violence. And it had an impact on me. And when I was about 13, I purposely started drinking, and I loved it. It made me 10 feet tall and bulletproof, and basically it made it so that I could talk to girls and dance and shoot pool and just feel like I belonged and I fit in. And I had no idea what that implied, as you might guess. Got in trouble the first time at 14. At 15, I got taken off a ski resort hill on a snowcat, an ambulance, and my stomach pumped. And so it became clear fairly early on that there was a good part to the drinking and there was a problem part. Over time, the problem part started to outweigh the good part. And well, for a while the good part outweighed the bad part. But in fact, for a while, I would get in trouble occasionally, but I would get out of it. And in the meantime, most of the good experiences I had were alcohol or drug related. And I could pay the price for the problem times. But by the time I was a senior in college, my what I would call today my karma started to change. Instead of getting pulled over and getting let go, I would get pulled over and get arrested. Instead of a girlfriend being upset with me, I'd lose a girlfriend. I had many instances in my college days of waking up after blackouts and wondering where my bicycle was and then where my car was, and then all sorts of things like that. And very importantly, I remember distinctly many, many times at all different ages waking up wishing I was dead. Only after drinking and doing drugs, but basically for me only after drinking. I never woke up wishing I was dead if there hadn't been some event that was alcohol related before that. And I didn't put that together as being a problem. They didn't have the alcohol education back then that they do now, but I have a feeling I could have successfully avoided any alcohol education anyhow, because I was not terribly teachable about things that I didn't want to hear. By the time I finished college, I really think that I had turned the corner. I actually think I turned the corner into an alcoholic on December 28th, 1974, when an event happened that was rather traumatic for me, which I won't go into. But it was then that I felt my karma changed. And after that, I was aware that I was different than other drinkers. And the way I would put it today is I didn't start drinking more, but what happened when I drank changed. Where I drank changed. Who I drank with changed. And I, without realizing it, became much more secretive in my drinking. Much more inclined to have a few drinks over here and then a few drinks over here and not let the people over here know about the people over there. And there was a pattern that was developing that it took me a long time to notice. And the most important part of that was I was not comfortable in my own skin. I had no peace. And I ended up a couple years after that, I ended up having a car accident, and luckily no one was killed, but I think it was, whether it's the grace of God or karma or what. I woke up in a hospital, and I didn't know, I woke up with my eyes closed, and I still very distinctly remember being aware that I was in what felt like a sterile environment, and I was cold, and I realized I was either in jail or in the hospital. And I wasn't too enthused about opening my eyes and finding out which it was, and it turned out to be a hospital. And a nurse came in and asked me how I was doing, and I asked her, I said, was anybody else hurt? And she said, no, no one else was hurt. And as soon as she said that, I wanted to drink. And that's probably not a good sign. And as a result of that, my dad, with whom I had a very difficult relationship, helped me get to see a psychiatrist. And there was a psychiatrist that ran the alcoholism program in our hometown. Very nice man. And he tried to help me. And I went to, I saw him the first time, and he said, do you think you have a problem with alcohol? And I said, yeah, I think I do. He said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, I think I had to quit drinking. And he said, well, how long? And I wasn't sure. He said, how about a year? And that didn't seem like a good idea to me. So I talked him down to 30 days. And he gave me antabuse, and he told me how antabuse worked, which is if you drink on it, you get violently ill. And he also mentioned that if you drink on it even several days after you stop taking it, that you can become ill. So I took the antabuse for 21 days. I didn't drink for 30 days and proved I was not an alcoholic, and started drinking again. And it pretty quickly didn't go well. And within a few months, I actually got pulled over one more time for, I was intoxicated, but I got pulled over for speeding, and they settled for that. And for some reason, I had some sort of insight, and I went home and basically detoxed myself on the couch and quit drinking for 2 years. And surprisingly, to me, life got better. I patched up work relationships. I became financially successful. I was being held in decent regard by a lot of people, but I had no peace, and I didn't know what that was about. But I do know that I wanted to be regarded as a responsible, respectable young man who was competent at work and well regarded in the community. And so that was the way I tried to live. And at that time, a friend of mine got a DWI, and his wife came to me because she knew that I had quit drinking. She said, can you help Bill stop drinking. And I said, you know, can you talk to him? And I said, I talked to him. And I said, you know, Bill, I haven't had a drink for about 2 years. I remember everything I've done. I've become successful at this, that, and the other thing. And if I were you, I would give up my driver's license and keep drinking. Because there is no joy in this. You know, I just couldn't get comfortable. And I should mention that during this time I was doing other drugs. I did not know the connection between alcoholism and drug addiction. It's a little embarrassing that I was that naive, but I was, and it's actually a little shocking to me. But I was taking Valium that was prescribed. I didn't run out of Valium for 7 years. And I didn't think that's not a problem. You certainly wouldn't want to let a good prescription go to waste. I was snorting cocaine as required, and I was smoking pot regularly, and regarded myself as a totally sober person. And after a couple of years, the ice was getting thin, and my mom was actually dying of cancer, and it was a difficult time, as you might imagine. And so I had a buddy who'd gotten sober in AA. He was a dear friend. He's got 35 years sober now. And he would come visit me from Washington, and he would go to meetings, and I would just think how much that proved what a worse drunk he was than I was. And but I knew about the meetings, and I knew that he really got a lot out of AA. As a matter of fact, he had sent me a big book after he got sober, which I found under the bed after 2 years. And so I went to a few meetings, and this is actually, I went towards Hunt's and Ron's home group, and I hadn't had a drink for 2 years when I showed up. I saw the God stuff. It was a bunch of old farts, most of whom were younger than I am now, and they didn't talk about drugs at all, and it wasn't prescribed, but I don't think anybody there had ever done any, so it just didn't occur to anybody to talk about drugs. And so the fact that I was smoking pot on the way to the meetings, you know, it didn't get brought up as an issue. So I went to a few meetings, and after a few of them, John F. Came up to me, and he said, "Chief, you know what your problem is?" And I said, "No, John, what's my problem?" He said, "You're dry, you're not sober." And I didn't know what that meant, but it pissed me off, so I didn't go back for 5 years. And I just was not teachable. And the dryness that, you know, we talk about in the rooms, that difference from emotional sobriety to simply being abstinent from alcohol, I have a keen appreciation for as a result of my own path. Just the not drinking and not doing drugs is just not sufficient for me. So the next 3 years after those few meetings, I generally didn't drink. I actually, after my mom passed away, I did leave town for a couple of weeks and drink with the intention of not drinking upon my return. I came back, I stopped drinking on the plane on the way home and did not drink. I had no obsession and no compulsion. I drank a few more times, planned for weddings and things like that. One trip to Atlantic City, which was not a brilliant idea, but my wife didn't get mad at me, so it was okay. And during that time I became quite successful in business, and I made a pretty fair amount of money. And had a business problem. IBM San Jose was my biggest customer. I live in New York, and we got a phone call, and one of our products is causing them a major problem. And I was in San Jose the next morning and dealt with the problem successfully. If I had failed, our company would have been bankrupted. And my then wife was with me, and I told her, I said, you know, I am so stressed and so unhappy. If I could just have 2 beers in the Wall Street Journal and know that I could have 2 more beers tomorrow, I would be happy. And the 2 beers would work much better than the Valium. And my wife was a sweetheart and codependent as hell. And she said, okay. Now at that time, I did not have a lot of AA experience, but I did have some intuition. And I said, honey, you know, I really appreciate your agreeing to let me drink, but if I really am an alcoholic, they say that this experiment probably won't work out. So it would be better if we didn't tell anybody that I was starting to drink again. Just in case it doesn't work out, that way it would be easier for me to quit. And she said, okay. And so this was 5 years after I had not been drinking and not having any problem at all, always having alcohol in the house. And the compulsion to drink came back in less than 24 hours. And I was sneaking drinks within 24 hours. And it didn't take too long for me to become a maintenance drinker. And so that was the bad news. The good news was becoming a maintenance drinker at that time led me into recovery. I ended up physically quite ill. I never missed work, and so that that helped me keep my defenses up. So I ended up maintenance drinking, and during this time that I was just diving into totally compulsive closet drinking, the company that I worked for was organized by a union, and they liked me. So after it was organized by the union, they made me president of the company to try and prevail and have the union not succeed. And it was an ugly time. It was the iron workers that are a pretty tough union. The company that I worked for was really poorly managed, and we did not treat our people well. And I was caught in a beautiful bind, what they call a double bind. There was nothing right I could do because I actually agreed with the employees to a large extent, and I was representing the ownership in my position. And that and closet drinking did not go along terribly well. So I hit a bottom, and my bottom was actually a surprise. It was not a car accident. It was not some major drama with my wife. It was one small thing that I did that I had always told myself I would never do. And as it happened, I was about to head into a blackout, and I popped out of the blackout and had the awareness that this was not the person I wanted to be. And that was on a Saturday night, and I was in rehab by Tuesday morning, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So I walked into this rehab 7 years after starting to think I needed to deal with my drinking, and I started getting better. And I mentioned some of this last night. The nurse was doing an eval. When she started the second page of drugs I had done, she said, "I think you're cross-addicted." And it was the first time I'd ever heard the term, and a little light switch went off. And then my first night in there, a guy was telling his story, and he started out by saying he was nervous and anxious, and then he started talking about how he had been in business and he did all these things, and one of which really struck me, which is buying an ounce of cocaine for New Year's, 2 days before New Year's, and having it gone before the New Year's party, and buying cases of alcohol at Christmas time as if he was having major parties and drinking it all himself. And as he was telling these stories, people were laughing. And that really helped me open up to change. And what happened was I started getting the idea of that drinking wasn't the only problem, and that there was other things that needed to change. And that really opened me up to learning what we talk about here, which really primarily has to do with the steps and the traditions, and ultimately led me to the Buddhist teachings. As we get into that, I want to start talking about the Four Noble Truths. Most people here have probably been exposed to the Four Noble Truths, but not everybody. The first noble truth is that it's usually said that life is suffering, or more accurately, there is suffering. And the Pali term is dukkha. And it generally means a broader thing than just suffering. As a matter of fact, I think I have, if I have that book, which I don't have. There's a quote that dukkha means a generally unsatisfactory aspect of life. And I was at a retreat with Joseph Goldstein earlier this year, and he said the roots of dukkha are du and ka, and du means bad. And ka actually is in regards to the hole in the center of a wheel. And so it's bad hole. So if you can imagine being in a cart where the hole in the wheel is off center, or it's not round, every time the wheel turns, you bump. So it's the unsatisfactory, ongoing unsatisfactory nature of life, dukkha. It's suffering. And a lot of us experience suffering pretty much all the time. So the first noble truth is about the inherent unsatisfactoriness of life. The second noble truth is that the suffering comes from desires and aversions. Usually the more proper translation is craving or clinging. We want this. We definitely don't want that. Now, I can't think of anything more apropos of the first step. We're powerless over alcohol and our lives have become unmanageable. And my craving for alcohol, my craving for drugs, my craving for respect, my craving to be well regarded, and my aversion to making mistakes, my aversion to being regarded poorly, my aversion to dealing with this, that, or the other thing in early parts of my life. And that is an ongoing thing for me to be working on. One of the reasons I really like the Buddhist teachings is it really emphasizes the ongoing practice of identifying the desires and the aversions as we continue down the path. And I think that's critical for me. When I was first wanting to not drink or feeling that my drinking was a problem, my whole goal was stop drinking, that's it, and get on with life. And as it turns out, even with a number of years abstinent, a number of years sober, that really doesn't cut it. It's not sufficient for me to simply figure that I have a win by not drinking. It's what do I need to be doing today to have inner peace? What do I need to be doing today to not be engaging in behaviors that cause me to have shame and guilt and leave me feeling good about myself? So the second noble truth is that all suffering comes from desires and aversions, cravings and aversions, clinging and aversions. Honey, could you do me a favor? Could you go get the Bhikkhu Bodhi book? Thanks. See how much better I'm doing? I could screw up and not have a book and not become suicidal. That's a lot of progress. The third noble truth is that there's a way to end the suffering. So the first one is that there is suffering. The second one is all suffering comes from desires and aversions. And the third is that there's something you can do about it. This is from a book by Kevin Griffin. Kevin is a member of 12-step groups, and he's written a couple of good books on Buddhist teachings. And here he's talking about, as I'm about to launch into the second step, and here Kevin is talking about whether there's a God or not. And as he puts it, Buddhism isn't about a deity or a Godhead that we worship, but it is about seeing the truth, and the truth is God. Buddhadasa talks about God being nature and the laws of nature, that which exists and the rules that govern that which exists. Step 2 in the 12-step traditions calls God a power greater than ourselves. The laws of nature are clearly this: powers beyond our control. Buddhadasa rejected the idea that some religions are theistic and others are non-theistic. He said that some religions personify God and others don't, but that the essence of God was not to be found in the outer shell and forms of those religions, but in the universal truths that religions share. And I like that. That works for me. Another way to put it in a little bit simpler terms is that Buddhism doesn't say that there is no God. It just simply doesn't personify God. And I think Kevin, in his less correct moments, would say that he doesn't have a magician God. And you know, I relate to that thought, because the first time I got blackout drunk that I recall when I was 14, I said the following prayer for the first time, but not the last time. God, please get me out of this one, and I will never do it again. I totally meant it. I was praying to God as if he were a magician, that he would reach down and touch me on the shoulder and say, you're okay, you're clean, you get to go. That's not the way I think of a higher power or God these days. It may be that there is a God that does that, it's just not the way I think about it. So I really don't want to convey that I know the truth. I'm just telling you really what my truth is today. And I think it makes a big difference for me as I proceed along this path. And what I wanted to start with, this book this year is a lot of what I've been thinking about is coming out of this little tiny book by Bhikkhu Bodhi called The Noble Eightfold Path. And I wanted to start with this. The search for a spiritual path is born out of suffering. Tell me if this sounds like the first step. It does not start with lights and ecstasy, but with the hard tax of pain, disappointment, and confusion. However, for suffering to give birth to a genuine spiritual search, it must amount to more than something passively received from without. It has to trigger an inner realization, a perception which pierces through the facile complacency of our usual encounter with the world to glimpse the insecurity perpetually gaping underfoot. When this insight dawns, even if only momentarily, it can precipitate a profound personal crisis. It overturns accustomed goals and values, mocks our routine preoccupations, leaves old enjoyments stubbornly unsatisfying. And that just speaks to me as far as what was going on. You know, my drinking wasn't working. It was causing a tremendous amount of suffering. I ended up in this rehab, and the guy was telling his story. And he was telling, giving examples of foolish, painful things like I had done, and people were laughing. And from that laughter, as far as I'm concerned, I got the second step. I didn't know it at the time. I sort of, this has dawned on me over the years subsequently. But I had been doing those things, and I had no ability to laugh about any of them. I was simply immersed in the pain. So I was stuck in the suffering, and I saw no solution. The suffering was coming from my craving and my aversion. And finally, I was able to get a grasp on what amounts to the third noble truth, that there is something you can do about it. And I started getting sober. The fourth noble truth is that we end our suffering by following the Eightfold Path. What happened with me before that was I got a sponsor, and he recommended that I do a third step. And he identified the third step as being two-part, as being faith and footwork. And I mentioned this last night. The two parts of the third step is one is making a commitment to do the rest of the steps. In Buddhist teachings, that would be making a commitment to live via the Eightfold Path. And then the second part is to be open to the feelings attached to the change that's going on. And for me, this is part of the lifelong thing that we're trying to do by living the steps and the traditions, is to not get to a place, okay, I'm good, I'm done drinking, I'm good, I'm done doing drugs, okay, I got the wife back, I got the husband back, I got the job back, whew, you know, thank God that's all over. So it's like in the big book when the guy comes out of the storm cellar and says, amen, and grand, the wind stopped blowing. You know, that's not sufficient to get to a place where you can really participate in life fully. Now, from a Buddhist standpoint, what we're aspiring to eventually is awakening. And in the deeper Buddhist teachings, it's actually to get to a point of ending samsara, this endless cycle of life and death, but backing it into just this life. What we want to do is, as far as I'm concerned, is wake up every day being glad we're alive. Not clinging to being alive, but being glad we're alive. So the two parts of the third step, faith and footwork, in Pali, the term for this type of faith is sada, S-A-D-H-A. And it speaks to faith based on experience or wisdom. So this is an important part of where my thinking in Buddhist terms shifts away from some of the more common things that might hear in meetings about, you know, my higher power will take care of everything. I believe that in the sense that the laws of nature or karma will take care of everything, and that amounts to a higher power. So karma is basically, in Buddhist terms, it is the laws of nature. It's the laws of cause and effect. And physicists these days have decided that the Buddhist concept of karma, cause and effect, fits in with what the physicists are finding as they get into subatomic physics. And it's a very, very interesting to read that basically you can't break the laws. If you don't pay attention to the laws of nature, you will get in trouble. If I drink, I will get in trouble. If I lie to people, bad stuff follows. If I change that and start living a more ethical and moral life, and start to live congruently between how I believe I should conduct myself and do conduct myself, I have less guilt and shame. I have less problems. But it's an evolving thing. Jack Kornfield, speaking on this, speaking about God and speaking about this type of thing. From where does our life of joy and sorrow arise? When the source of creation is personified, it is given names like Allah, Brahma, or God. The divine source can also be experienced outside of personification. Mystics and meditators who describe this source experience the cosmos as coming out of a sacred emptiness, a great void. Jewish mystics describe it like this: out of the emptiness, God has made the world. It exists in the heart of God alone. To know our place, we must again become as nothing. Then what is holy will move through us and illuminate all that we do. So that's not the Buddhist, it's actually a quote of a Jewish mystic, but it's being quoted from the Buddhist context of we all are intertwined, we're all codependent. It's called codependent arising, actually, not codependent in the alcoholism model. But none of us can exist alone. None of us can exist in isolation.
G, could you mention the book that you
This is After the Ecstasy, the Laundry.
Thank you.
Which I love the title. So there's suffering. All suffering comes from desires and aversions. There's something we can do about it. And what we can do about it is live the Eightfold Path. I'm going to go a little out of order and see. Does anybody have any questions or comments or concerns?
Could you tell me the name of the author of the last book you're reading?
This is Jack Cornfield, and this is Kevin Griffin.
No, no, the other one.
Jack Cornfield.
No, the other one.
Okay. This one. This one. Okay. It's Bhikkhu Bodhi. BHIKKHU BODHI.
B-O.
DHI.
So I was going to ask if you can send out a mailing list, suggested reading.
I can, and actually I have one from last year, but it's sort of outdated. Just because during the course of the last year I've read a lot more, so I'll update it and get that out. I'd be happy to do that. Yes?
And you use the term codependent arising?
Yeah,
They talk about
it's correctly, it's dependent co-arising.
Dependent co-arising.
Yes.
That clears it up.
It's like the difference between the Marlboro Man and being a team. There's no way to live in isolation. Thich Nhat Hanh, Terry and I were at a retreat last summer, and he would talk about how in a cup of tea you can see the clouds, the rain, the tea bush. Everything is totally interdependent. And in Buddhist teachings, basically the most profound delusion that we have is that we exist separately from each other. Now this actually is a totally Christian teaching also, although I think there's probably more emphasis on it in the Buddhist dogma, the Buddhist teachings. And if you were to really study Buddhism, you would actually get to a point where as you became say a deep meditator, someone who's really getting into it, you would get to a point of realizing that this entire room, this city, this earth is created by our consciousness rather than our consciousness being created by it. And again, the physicists are going, oh, you know, that actually turns out to be correct.
Yeah.
But we're really getting into serious teachings that I think it'd really be great for everybody in this room to pursue. I find it very interesting and totally beyond my comprehension. I mean, I can't tell you how many books, articles, YouTube things that I've looked at and read. And I ponder as I meditate and as I'm walking around in the world. And yet, how does one get there? Now the good news is if you happen to end up being a Buddhist, you've got thousands of lives to figure that out. As a matter of fact, I was at another retreat. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be going into it in a minute. And so two really prominent people, Joseph Goldstein, who's the author of one of these books, and one of the co-founders of Insight Meditation Society. He was one of the teachers, and the other was a Buddhist monk named Analio, who is German-born, lives in Sri Lanka. He's a monk and a scholar. He has a PhD in Buddhist studies. He holds professorships in Sri Lanka, Germany, and Taiwan. What we were studying that retreat, the Satipatthana Sutta, he translated out of Chinese, out of Pali, out of Sanskrit into English, which is not his native language. The guy is brilliant, and he meditates half the time. So he's a professor in 3 different continents. He's a scholar, and he meditates half the time. And he said he's become quite productive in his scholarship. He writes a lot. He said all the writing he does comes about as a result of his focusing on what are called the 5 hindrances, which we'll get to in a minute. But basically from his meditation. He meditates half the time. He goes on from his meditation and does his life. Now in the meantime, he's turned over all of the what do you get when you write a book? The commissions, the royalties from this book. He's given them all away. All of the donations that are made to him, he gives away. He's following the monk's life of really having nothing but his robes and his bowl. And he was one of the happiest guys you'd ever see. But where I was going with that was that at some point a person, one of the students on the retreat asked, do you know any enlightened people? Any of these people have become awakened? So he's asking these two well-known teachers, and between them, they could only think of one person that they thought might be enlightened, a nun a Buddhist nun from India. And when they were talking about writings from people that had become enlightened, they had to go all the way back to the 12th century to have to quote someone in their experience of actually becoming an enlightened person. And they basically said, you know, most people, if they become enlightened, they don't talk about it. So it's not something that when we sit here and we practice these things in this room or on a retreat, wherever one would go on retreats, most of us are not likely to become enlightened in this lifetime. And at the same time, it's still well worth pursuing, in my view. Yeah, sure.
Is this similar to A Course in Miracles? Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with A Course in Miracles. In some ways, I would say yes. However, I would say that it's A Course in Miracles is more restrictive. And it really depends on direct communication from an entity to, because it flowed through the author, if I recall correctly. And I think that that personifies the higher power in a way that is different from Buddhism. But a lot of the teachings, I think, are about the same. Yeah.
Hi, so this is really interesting. This is the first time that I've really been introduced to Buddhist thought. I really don't know anything about it. And in fact, I thought it was worshiping the Buddha, but it's, you know, so this is really good information. And I just wanted to comment on the Four Noble Truths, because I like how you've aligned it with the steps, and I think that there, in the first one, there is suffering, and I love what you said about the bad hole, because, you know, one of my concepts in recovery is, you know, we have that dark hole inside that we have to constantly feed to feel okay. So it's interesting because it's kind of like we start off with this black hole we sort of are born with or whatever, and you know, we fill it, which is like, it's not just this. So it's kind of a flip. We're not just suffering because we're filling it, but we're filling it because we're suffering. And it's like the cycle that never ends. And then what, you know, in 12-step world, what fills it, we turn to our higher power, and that fills us up. And so that's really right in line. That's sort of that frame of reference for the whole process. It really lines up with the Buddhist Four Noble Truths. The idea of the bad hole.
Right, yeah, thank you. Thank you. And just taking that the next step further is the lining up with the higher power fits in with continuing to do this work. And that, I think, is essential, whether you're working from a 12-step perspective or a Buddhist perspective, is this is where I am, and now I need to keep going. It's proceeding along the path, rather than say, okay, I've arrived, and to enjoy each step of the way, rather than I'm here, I have to hold my breath for a while because my happiness is out there in the future. Be happy now, and keep hiking, which is way different than the way I always live. Is when I get this, then I'll be happy. When I get out of this, then I'll be okay. And it's right here and now, and that's easy to say and much harder to live.
And also I like what you said yesterday, as opposed to what you're saying today. Like, don't worry about being enlightened. Like, you will probably not be enlightened, but be awake.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's
like settle for being awake. That's how I.
You know, the thing is, it's not settling. It is very powerful. And yeah, but I think how I would take what you're saying is, one of the things as we meditate is and I said it last night, don't worry about being a good meditator. Don't worry about being a good AA. Don't worry about being a good Buddhist. Just practice this stuff. It is, none of this is commandments. It's all, you know, it's being the best person I can be today without thinking I'm better than anybody else. Did I see another hand? Yes.
Yeah, I don't understand the enlightenment, I don't think, because...
That's okay, you're in good company.
You said that that some of the great minds in Buddhism today said that there was one nun in India
There was enlightened, yes.
that was enlightened. Isn't that mean that there she is, she's enlightened? Isn't that a conflict in the whole, my idea of enlightenment, you know? Because that's like, okay, I've arrived, you know, and so now what? You know, it's like, in my mind, when I say, oh, this person's enlightened, I'm stopping the process. You know, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand.
And it doesn't seem like, you know, that nun in India probably isn't sitting there saying, I'm enlightened.
Correct.
So what differentiates her from...
Strictly in Buddhist terms, what it would mean is that she will no longer be cycling back through life and death. She will have ended the cycle of samsara, and she will have...
so she just goes into the all that is.
Very well put. That was actually perfectly put, yes.
Oh, okay, that explains it, thank you.
And the rest of us we're likely to come back either in a less favorable or more favorable situation.
Okay.
You know, one of the things that in the West, the West is, the Buddhist teachings are pretty ecumenical, and they're influenced by all the different traditions of Buddhist teaching, whether it's the Theravada, or Mahayana, or Zen, or the Tibetans. Up until 50 years ago, you learned the Buddhism that they taught in your village. You know, there was no way that somebody in Thailand was going to be learning what the Tibetans were practicing. And since it's come to the West, the various teachers, like all the people that I have here, are incorporating various teachings. And it's much more secular. Much of the teachings going on in the West are taught by teachers rather than by monks. And so it's a different flavor than there has been historically. And what they're trying to do is really get back as close to the original Buddhist teachings, the Buddhist teachings, rather than all the variations that you can imagine over 2,500 years. And you've got 5 or 6 or 10 people that followed each other in a given village, and the verbal transmission of the teachings, things change. But what they're talking about generally, actually in Asia, if you were a Buddhist, there's a very good chance that you would be practicing Buddhism the way many Christians in the U.S. practice their religion. You know, they go to church once or twice a year, they follow the rituals, they make donations. As a matter of fact, the Somalia talked about in Sri Lanka, the people would come up to them rapidly to give them their dana, to give them their contributions so they could have a favorable rebirth. But they say that in Thailand and Burma, 90% of the monks don't meditate or study the teachings. They're really more into the ritual of Buddhism rather than the teachings. So what we're doing here has more to do with what was originally taught 2,500 years ago than if we were to go to many monasteries in Southeast Asia now. Now this isn't exclusively true. There's at least a couple of people in this room that have actually gone on retreats in various monasteries where Buddhist teachings are followed very, very closely and very skillfully. Yes?
I was just thinking about interdependence and how we all need each other, and I was just going back to the first word of the first step, we. And how drinking, I tried to do it I, and it didn't work. And the power of being interdependent and the need for other people. So I just wanted to say that.
It's well put, and I think it's essential. As a matter of fact, in the Buddhist teachings, I don't have it in the outline here, there are the three jewels: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And when they speak of the Buddha, they are not speaking of a deified Buddha. They are speaking of the Buddha in each of us, our Buddha nature. So the first jewel is the Buddha nature, the awakened one. The second is the Dharma, which is the teachings, or what they regard as the truth. And the third is the Sangha, or the community, the Buddhist community. I don't think it's much closer to the whole AA thing than, we've got Bill and Bob, and we've got the program, and we have the fellowship. And I think all those pieces are really important. So it's yet another really profound parallel. If that's it for questions, I was thinking we would do a bit of meditation, and it's probably going to take up pretty close to the end of this segment.